This is Jay's analysis. Welcome. We are now talking about Book 7 of the Republic, probably the most famous chapter in the history of Western philosophy. This will, of course, be the Allegory of the Cave, and if you've been listening to the rest of the Plato talks, I highly recommend you do so if you haven't. If you have, then you heard Book 6. We dealt with Plato's view of knowledge and what I call the noetic light of the intelligible sun. What does that mean? Well, noesis, right, is the way that Plato conceives of knowledge occurring in the mind. And there's an illumination that comes from the celestial realm or the spiritual realm or the realm of the forms, however you want to categorize that, that enlightens the mind from a central single source. And in Pythagoreanism, that source would be the monad. And if you remember what we talked about in Book 6, I think a little bit of review is going to be helpful, because Book 7 follows upon the epistemology of Book 6. So 7 will deal with the ontology of Plato and the epistemology of Plato based on the fairly extensive description that we had in Book 6. And if you remember, Book 6 was the sunlight analogy. So if we think about the natural world, we see the sun, and the sun illuminates all the objects of our experience. These objects then enter our senses, particularly in this case sight, and from the light that originates in the sun, all things have their noetic source, in other words. So when we learn about objects in the world, it's due to the light that comes from a single source, the sun. Now for Plato, that's an analogy, that's an allegory. It's a type. It's a type of what happens in the mental realm. In the mental realm, there's this other world, the world of the forms, and it's there that we find the essence of things, right? So contrary to what Aristotle will later say, the essence of an object is not found in its material substance, the form that's there in front of you that you sense with your empirical senses, but rather the lux, the light of the sun, of the celestial or mental realm, is what truly gives objects their essence. And an essence, of course, is that which a thing must have in order to be that thing. And as we saw as well, opinions are associated with sense data. So you might have an opinion that it's going to rain tomorrow, but you don't actually know that it's going to rain tomorrow, right? And so you might actually be correct. It may rain tomorrow, but you didn't know that it was going to rain tomorrow, because for Plato, and as well as for the Pythagoreans, knowledge is certainty, and it's mathematical certainty. So in Book 6, we also saw the analogy of the point and the line, right, and geometrical forms, which are ideational or abstract, right? They're not dependent on material objects for their invariance and for their certainty. So a triangle will always be a triangle, no matter how many times in the world we destroy a triangle, or we draw one and erase it, or we build a pyramid and tear it down, right? When we do that, we're not destroying the triangle, because the triangle is a mental, conceptual, formal object. And so for Plato, that signifies much more than just a thought in one's head. That's actually a whole other realm of existence. And not only that, that other realm of existence is more real than the material realm in front of us. And that's what sets Platonism off against so many other philosophies, is that it locates the essence of objects, the real reality, in the beyond the here and now. For Plato, the here and the now, of course, is transient, and it's the realm of what he calls becoming. So becoming is always in perpetual flux. It's always in change. It's always in a state of change from one state of matter to another. Water can go from a liquid to a solid when it becomes ice, right? And so we can't locate the form or the essence of an ice cube or something like that in the fact that it's an ice cube, because it can also melt and become water. So it's no longer, when it becomes water, it's lost its essence. And an essence can no longer. You can't change. You can't have changing essences of things. They're static. They're stable, and that's why, of course, for Plato, they connect directly to things like mathematical formulas, geometrical principles, squares, angles, right? Geometry. And as we saw as well for Plato, the lowest level of knowledge would be imagination, and this is just, kind of thinking up things, out of hand, bullshitting in your mind, coming up with crazy stuff. That then leads one to a greater level of knowledge, which he calls belief, which is based on some notion of evidence and empirical data. But this is still at the bottom of the knowledge tree, I guess we could say, the knowledge totem pole. Above that is thought, in the Greek dianoia, and that's discursive reasoning. So that would be reasoning from premises to conclusions, something like a syllogism. But even that is not the highest level of knowledge. So if Plato were to meet a group of scientists and mathematicians, he would say to the scientists, well, you have a degree of knowledge that's certainly better than, some guy who's out there just bullshitting on the street. But your empirical science that you do is still very limited and flimsy and subject to quite a bit of fluctuation and change, because the world is fluctuating, changing, and our senses can often be very deceiving. And then Plato might turn to the mathematicians and say, you have a higher degree of certainty and knowledge than the scientists and the biologists over there, Mr. Mathematician. But it's still not good enough, because when you're talking about all these mathematical objects, what links all of those things together? Right? What's the source from which the mathematical principles arise? Right? They can't just be floating out there invariant on their own. They have to be linked together in some source, right? So in other words, 2 + 2 = 4, and that a circle has 360 degrees. These are two different mathematical principles or truths. Why is it that both of them share this property that we call trueness or truth? Well, that would suggest that they come from some single source, right? They don't just happen to be invented by, say, two different competing gods or something. They come from a single source. So for Plato, that single source would be the monad, the sun, the one of the intelligible realm. And that light that we get from, for lack of terms, we could call it God, even though for Plato, the God of Plato is certainly not going to be, like the God of biblical theology or something like that. It's more of an impersonal abstract principle, but it's an impersonal abstract principle that kind of links everything together in what we might call the source or something like that. Now, this source is this one is what ultimately is the locale from which all truths originate. And not only all truths, but also all forms. And forms are ultimately the real truths of things, right? So the form of the tree, the form of man, the form of objects, and so forth. These are like the mathematical truths, the geometrical principles, and they all originate in the one, the form of the good. And once you ascend beyond the mathematical principles, then you begin, in Plato's mind, to look directly at the intelligible sun, right? Then you have noetic knowledge, right? So discursive, mathematical, and logical syllogistic reasoning is still a step below noetic understanding. And noetic understanding is, again, this idea that it's not just mathematical certainty that's good enough. There's a level of knowledge beyond that we almost might call mystical, but it's not mystical in that it's irrational. It's mystical in that it's attained, in Plato's mind, through a lifetime of philosophy. And that's what we're going to see in Book 7, is that this lifetime of philosophy, rigorous training that is not antithetical to mathematics or the sciences. In fact, mathematics and the sciences actually constitute the early stages of philosophic training for the philosopher king. And then later in life, some 20 years after you've done your studies in the academy of Plato, then you graduate perhaps into the status of the philosopher king. And it's, of course, the philosopher kings who are going to rule the Callipolis, which is the ideal city of Plato's Republic. So that was book 6, as we saw last time, and this is going to transition into book 7, as we said, with this most famous analogy and allegory in the history of Western philosophy, and perhaps even Western literature as a whole, except for maybe the Bible or something like that, which is the allegory of the cave. But you have to understand what's in book 6 to really get the meaning of the allegory of the cave. Because a lot of times this is referred to and people banter around about the allegory of the cave and they don't really know what it's about. It's not really about society being like a lying, deceiving, corrupting institution or something like that. I mean, it kind of is. That's somewhat relevant to what Plato's talking about, but it's not really what he's talking about. Because as we saw, Plato is actually arguing for communism. Yes, the Republic is a communistic, socialistic, collectivist society. So the allegory of the cave is not about the individual anarchist coming to realize the falsity of the Federal Reserve and rebelling against the system and striking out on his own, as it's so often portrayed. No. Plato, in fact, thinks anarchy and democracy are the worst forms of government because they're chaotic. They're not ordered. Plato's Republic is all about order. It's all about laws. It's all about a sort of top-down pyramidal structure, as we saw with the philosopher king or kings at the top, and then the guardian class, and then the working class. Thus, all communistic and Marxist revolutionaries and revolutions and collectivist systems originate in Plato. That's why they're called republics. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. The French Republic, right? The French communist Marxist government. These all come out of Plato. And we've seen that before, but that has to be kept in mind because, again, so many people use the allegory of the cave in the inappropriate way. Plato's allegory of the cave is not out of step with a rigid hierarchical structure. The Republic is a rigid hierarchy. So now that we've seen the noetic light of the intelligible sun, which illuminates the mind of the philosopher to see the forms in the form of the good truly, in the last book, we can transition into and understand the meaning of the allegory of the cave. So for Plato, the social order as a whole is actually like a bunch of people stuck in a cave. Now, you have to understand and perhaps have some knowledge of Homer, right, the Iliad and the Odyssey, to understand what came before Plato and what Plato's trying to do by introducing this allegory. So the journey of Odysseus into Hades that happens in book 11 of the Odyssey, that is actually the setting for the allegory of the cave. This is not just some cave. Plato's speaking to a group of people who were familiar with the Homeric tradition, and the Homeric tradition was, of course, oral, right? It was an oral tradition that was passed down, very vast, and so that's what they would have had in their mind, right? The people of Athens that he's talking to would have been thinking, oh, this is, this cave that's being talked about is kind of like the dead. And so the shade of the dead Achilles that speaks these words to Odysseus, who's visiting Hades, right? That is who Plato's talking about when he talks about likening the dwellers in the cave to the dead. He's talking about sort of being in the underworld. And he's saying, you're already dead. And the cave then ultimately is not just some social order of like control or something. The cave is this world, right? It's this level of reality, which is something that tends to imprison man in the obsession and fixation on the fading and passing phantasms of this life, right? Which is temporal, which is constantly in flux. It's in a state of becoming. And this is set over against and contrasted to the world of atemporal, eternal truths, principles, forms, and being, right? So there's this dialectic of becoming and being, right? Change versus stasis. And this is crucial to Plato and Platonism in the history of Western philosophy, because this is, as we've seen, all about dialectics, right? So dialectics is always setting things in tension and then to ultimately try to synthesize them into some sort of triangulation, right? Then, of course, this comes to the fore in Hegel as kind of the apex of the Platonic tradition in the West. So shadows and images are like sculptures, right? So if we think of things like poetry, sculptures, these are mirrors and shadows and images of real objects, right? So if you think of the statue of David, right, in Italy, in Rome, I suppose, this is supposed to be a copy of the actual King David, but it's not the real King David. And what Plato is saying is that, okay, look, when you see all these objects out in the world, those are just like statues. They're like mirrors, copies. And the real objects are the objects that subsist in the realm of the forms. Now, the form of all the forms, ultimately, I guess we could say, is the form of the good. And mathematics and geometric principles are the bridge from which we move from space-time, temporal flux, into the realm of atemporal, eternal truths, right? It's mathematics that most clearly shows us these things, and that's why Plato is ultimately working within the Pythagorean tradition. So the objects of sense are unreliable. They are not the true objects of knowledge. And there is, for this reason, one of the great questions of philosophy that's, you can always bring this out, say in apologetics or apologetical discourses or debates. If you're debating someone who is, say, an atheist or an empiricist, is what's called the notion of identity over time. And so Plato would make this point that if we think about an object, like, or a person, me, you, right? What is it that makes it that person, that object, that what gives it that identity over time, right? Because a child is at one time a baby, and he's small and he's shitting everywhere and he's cooing and crying. And then, 30 years later, he's a full-grown entity that is in many ways quite different from the baby that he was 30 years prior. Now, what is it then that is the unifying factor, essence, whatever, that subsisted over those years, right? Because it's a completely different bodily object from the baby, right? The much bigger, smarter, the brain has grown quite a bit. And so to all appearances, except for maybe some facial features or a birthmark, this is a completely different material object. And so this is called, right, the problem of identity over time. Now, to the modern world, because it's dispensed with metaphysics and because it's dispensed with the notion of essences, then this is why you have all this nonsense of there not being any gender, that your identity can be changed at will, sort of the plasticity, right? The plasticity of humanity and human nature and objects. And that's because it all originates in a certain flawed philosophical view of the world and of objects in the world. If those objects are created objects and objects that have a meaning given to them by their very nature and by their essence by, say, a creator, then identity over time makes sense, right? Because it's grounded in the eternal creative power and energy of God. If objects are random, chaotic productions of just flux and atoms and molecules bouncing about, then they don't have any inherent meaning, principle, form, substance, or essence. They don't have identity over time. Identity is simply something that humans have constructed in their minds and attached to objects, right? And so if they're just socially created terms, token terms given to something or to a person or to whatever, things like gender or names or lineage, or then they can just as easily be dispensed with or taken away. Right? They're just as real as, it's just breath coming out of someone's vocal cords. They're not real descriptors of properties that beings or objects have. They're just terms, just names, right? And they can just be interchangeable, right? So we can just make the boys girls and the girls boys, and these words have no more meaning than their opposites. That's the view of the modern world, and that's the view that's arisen since the dominance of empiricism and the empirical philosophy. And it's that absurd and preposterous, but most of humanity just doesn't really seem to care. And that itself is a great testimony to the truth of Book 7, The Allegory of the Cave, because Plato would look at this and say, yeah, it's always been that way. Most people follow their senses, and they think that that's philosophy, and they think they're scientists, and they think that that's wisdom, and they're pragmatists, and they're sophists, and they're relativists, and they deny essences. They're deontologists, right? And they think that this is the height of wisdom, when in actual fact they are fools and they are trapped in the cave. So that application is true. And it's this world that deceives them. It's their senses and their passions that deceive them. And so they're too trapped within their passions to see beyond the fluctuating becoming of this world. Now, for those trapped in the cave, they believe the opposite of everything that is true. Now, how obvious is that to us now? When we look out in the world and we see these people who, believe that, say the social justice warriors, right? These people that believe that all of these things are strictures and inventions of the tyrannical patriarchy to keep them enslaved or something ridiculous like this, right? Like the idea that gender and gender roles or these kinds of things are actual metaphysical principles out in the world. Right? These people believe that becoming, change, right, is better than eternality or being or stasis, conserving, staying, passing on a tradition, right? These people believe that, in fact, the opposite is true. They believe that change, think of Obama's phraseology and sloganeering during his campaigns, right? Change, change, change. What the fuck does that even mean, right? It has no meaning. It's just repeat these phrases, right? Progress, right? What does that mean? These people, mathematics, Obama, Common Core, right? Let's get rid of the traditional way of looking at mathematics and geometry and introduce these weird ways of trying to do things that don't focus on abstract thinking. Right. So in any area of the spectrum of life and thought, the people trapped in the cave will believe the opposite. Right. They will think that their opinion is what constitutes knowledge. And it is not opinions that constitute knowledge. Opinions are not knowledge. And so, for example, mathematical truths, right? 2 + 2 is 4. That is the opposite of an opinion. It's the opposite of something related to taste, right? I like Creed and you like U2, man. No. For Plato, that is, once again, the norm for those trapped in the cave. So the people that are trapped in the cave mistake opinion and taste and subjectivity for knowledge. And that's because they're fixated on shadows and phantasms. The education of the soul, right, is what ultimately will lead the true philosopher up the ladder of knowledge that we saw in Book 6 towards the form of the good. But not everybody is capable of this, right? So Plato thinks that you've only got a certain select number of people who are going to be well-bred and who are going to be fit for the the lifestyle and of guardianship, which is the elite warrior class. And then out of that elite warrior class, you're only going to have a certain number of people who are fit and then capable of going on further into being philosopher kings. So you're looking at individuals who have training in music and poetry, physical endurance, and mathematics. This is then followed for some years, right? This is then followed by what Plato believes would be a good 3 years of compulsory military service. So you have, again, this is a very collectivist statist regime. 3 years of military service that then is followed by 10 years of hardcore mathematics. You're not done yet. So after 10 years of hardcore mathematics, now you're ready for rhetoric and dialectic. So you receive 5 more years training in dialectics. Now, dialectics what is that? Well, that's the process of philosophy. It's the alenctic method that we've seen Socrates engage in with all of his interlocutors, questioners, and opposition throughout the different dialogues. So all the dialogues that you've heard me give lectures on prior to the Republic, and then into the Republic with all the different chapters, that constitutes examples of use of dialectic. Now, you're not done yet. So after you've had, 20 or 15 years or so of this kind of training, you got another 15 years of training to do in practical political philosophy. So you go from all that to the theory. You move out of the realm of the here and now into the realm of the abstract and into theory and mathematics, dialectics. Then you move back down into the realm of the here and the now with pragmatic politics and political philosophy. Practical politics are compelled to lift up the radiant light of the soul to the good itself, equipping one to be a philosopher king in Plato's mind. So you note then that for Plato, it's not anti-scientific. It's not anti-sciences or the arts. It's all of those things, right? This is probably roughly where the history of the Western philosophical education comes from, right? Where the pedagogy as a whole in the West, classical liberal arts and so forth, would go back to this. And so from this, the restriction of the dialectical method has to be postponed until people are mature enough to use it, who have mastered the sciences. So you can't just go into dialectics. There's a certain pattern and progress that you go through, based on, I guess, whatever Plato's come up with from his Pythagorean education that allows you to go from the arts and then into mathematics and then into politics. And the reason for that would be the fact that dialectics is and can be very dangerous, right? So dialectical methodology can be used for good or for bad, right? So it can also be used to corrupt things. And we saw this in the discussions that we've had with previous challengers to Plato and Socrates, namely the sophists. And it's the sophists who go out, as we saw in a couple books back, go out and tell people what they want to hear, right? These are the pop philosophers, the self-help guys out there that are telling people what they want to hear. They're not real philosophers, but they kind of dress it up in some fancy terms. And that dupes the masses. The masses love to hear, these itching, their ears are itching for these kinds of things, and it sounds good, gives them warm fuzzies, and that's who, the reason Plato has such disdain for the sophists is precisely because of that. They're the pop philosophers who tell people what they want to hear. You've been listening to Jay's Analysis. This is my breakdown of Plato's Republic. If you'd like to hear the rest of the lecture, as well as the archives of past Plato lectures, as well as other philosophy talks and interviews, go to jaysanalysis.com and you can subscribe at the PayPal link there for $4.95 a month, where I send out my lectures to you in email. Thank you for listening, and check out jaysanalysis.com. Also, check out my book, Esoteric Hollywood: Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which can be ordered at amazon.com.